Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Nemertes' Emerging Technology Research Study webinar series. Today, we'll be focusing on cloud computing, open source, and data analytics. I'm John Burke, Nemertes' CTO. I'm joining you today instead of Jerry Murphy, who did the original research for this project. So his name's still on the title slide, but I'm the happy man talking to you today. I'd like to encourage everybody to take a look at episodes 1 and 2 of this series, which are available on Bright Talk and, of course, also via the Nemertes website. As we chug along here, please submit any questions that you have via the Bright Talk Q&A panel. It's there off to the right on the screen that you're looking at. And I'll either jump right on them and answer them right away, or I will answer them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. With that said, let's dive right in. And we'll change the slide. So the Emerging Technologies Research Study was a series of interviews with approximately 20 firms, not approximately, with exactly 20 firms across 10 industries, 7 of them in financial services, and most of the financial services companies large. And the goal of this study was to poke into how organizations were dealing with a broad array of bellwether technologies, either at the very cutting edge of IT currently, like quantum cryptography, or just things that there's a steadily advancing frontier of progress. And so, of course, keeping up on them is important in IT when you're looking at emerging technologies. Today's session is going to be focusing on cloud computing and data and analytics. If you're interested in amplified intelligence or AI stuff, intelligent automation, client experience, those were the topic of the preceding episode in the series, episode 2. And episode 1 was a broad overview of the entire study and the high-level results from it. So for our purposes, we're looking at deployment of emerging and cutting edge technologies in cloud and open source. And in data analytics, we were looking at some specific pieces of the landscape there, the deployment of data science platforms, various aspects of metadata management, and the use of both data warehouses and data lakes. And as you'll see, we saw some pretty divergent results out of this. It's important also to note that we're not asking about 24 technologies in each of these areas. We just picked a small handful across them as we consider them bellwethers. They're a good way of assessing in a sort of quick and dirty way how far a company has progressed in its embrace of the area in technology. And of course, we also look at not just technologies, but the organizational practices and frameworks that support the use of those technologies. So state of adoption is only one piece of our broader assessment of the maturity of an organization in its use of cloud, open source, data and analytics. In addition to looking at whether they're deploying the technology, we're looking pretty closely at how and how much value they're realizing from their deployment of that technology, whether they've got a team focused on it, whether it's an actual dedicated organizational unit or a sort of a tiger team spanning other existing teams, whether they have actually defined clearly their own use cases for the technologies in that area. Have they established the metrics and the KPIs that they'll be using to judge how successful they are, what kind of value they're deriving from the deployment of technology in those use cases? We're looking for budgeting. Have they actually put their money where their mouth is and put resources on the line for this technology space? And then governance. Do they have a strategy, an architecture, a roadmap, and accountability at the organizational level for the use of this technology? If something goes great, who do they reward? If something goes wrong, who do they point the finger at and say what's going on? And then we're even also looking for things like training programs. Do they have the ability to bring new people on board and get them up to speed in these technologies that are becoming crucial to their operations? And lastly, have they formally wrapped it into their operations? Do they have it wired into the processes that they've got defined, into their documents and procedures. So looking at not just technology adoption, but across all of these things, we're trying to assess really the level of maturity that an organization is displaying in its use of these technologies. What we saw was that across all of the areas in the study, the ones that we've talked about in previous episodes, the ones in the 3 episodes yet to come, across all of these areas, data and analytics was the area in which these organizations had, hands down, the highest level of maturity. And as you'll see in a moment, nearly half have achieved what we call anticipatory level of maturity, which is really impressive. We have seen that although most organizations have embraced cloud computing, that they've done so in sort of a reactive way and still are working on a lot of those maturity components that have to do with using it sustainably, using it properly, and using it accountably. Most of the movement to cloud has been via SaaS and to a lesser extent PaaS. When you're talking about stuff that used to run in the data center, a lot of it still is running in the data center and not being run in IaaS. Instead, some of it's in IaaS. There's a lot of work around getting more into IaaS, and the hybrid model totally dominates with a lot of stuff still in data centers. Especially with financial services organizations, one reason there's still a lot of stuff in data centers is perception of risk associated with PII being off premises, PII being stored outside the boundaries of the enterprise itself. And in some cases, folks have requirements that forbid them from storing it anywhere but on premises. And in other cases, it's just reluctance, fear, caution. And that issue of data, both on premises and in cloud, is one of the biggest issues remaining in the data and analytics space. How to present a unified view of and deal with unified governance of information that is spread across on-premises and multiple cloud environments. So let's dig in a little. First off, I believe we need to talk about the maturity model briefly. And in that quick overview, our maturity model, which is fairly broadly situated. It's able to address a broad variety of technology areas or even areas outside technology. We have only 4 levels in the maturity model: unprepared at level 0 and anticipatory at level 3. And the arc of progress is from being in a state unprepared where you lack the necessary information to take effective action in that area, and are either unaware of or unable to effectively respond to current or emerging issues in that space. So you are just caught flat-footed if something goes wrong, or if something pops up, you're not able to take advantage of it. Fairly unusual to be there in a mature technology organization for very long. People pretty much move into level 1, reactive, relatively quickly, where you've got the basics in place and you can react to things, new business requirements. You can react to challenges or threats, but you're not really in a position to take proactive action where you can sort of get ahead of the curve and prevent things from happening or take advantage of them before they come and hit you in the face, basically, and you have to react. Proactive, therefore, is that next level of maturity, all the way up to anticipatory, where you've got not just the tools in place, but also the organizational structures, processes, staffing, budgeting, all that kind of stuff in place, so that when the unknown opportunities or threats or challenges come up, you're in a position to just take them in stride. The high-level summary on enterprise maturity on these 2 areas that we're looking at. In cloud and open source, we find a surprising 50% of organizations are still hovering in that unprepared space where they're just kind of willy-nilly moving into cloud without enough of a plan, without enough organizational support, without metrics, all that kind of superstructure that's required to be really good at being in that space over time. Contrast that with data and analytics, where nobody's in that space anymore, and instead 80% are in the anticipatory level of use of data analytics. They are ready for the next opportunity, ready for the next challenge, ready for the next threat, whatever it happens to be, or at least they're in a good position to deal with it, even if they wind up not succeeding. That's always a possibility. So let me see, digging into the cloud and open source side of things, we were focusing as bellwethers on use of multi-cloud and in a coordinated fashion with a security policy engine in place to help in that coordination, use of service mesh, service proxy, and either remote procedure or API gateways to tie together microservice and service-oriented architectures and control communications and security within them. And we were looking at security on and security using open source. So we'll dig into all of those in turn. But at the summary level, we saw that there was a solid residual of folks in the unprepared space on any given criterion that we were looking at, except, of course, realizing value. Everybody who deployed cloud and was working with open source and security saw the value in it. So at least at that level, we saw some improvement over what remains a disquietingly unprepared population out there. And I think the takeaway is probably best captured by the comment from one of the telecom participants that company policy is now cloud first for everything. New projects go into cloud unless they can't. And that, in a nutshell, is the cloud strategy for most of the companies that we talk to these days. Cloud first unless it can't. And what really varies a lot is unless it can't. What lies behind can't for that company in that industry at their point in their own various IT life cycles. And that's where we see the most, not just reason for, but justification for our confidence that on-premise computing is going to continue to be a significant portion of enterprise IT, especially as you get larger for most organizations. There's projects that can't go into cloud for a variety of reasons, ranging from performance to data propriety. And it's a strong residual. And new use cases for on-premise computing are coming up as edge computing use cases continue to multiply, and the need for ultra low latency computing in certain use cases continues to increase. We find there's also some relevance to the attitudes summed up in some of these comments from financial services participants. We're relatively new to cloud. We've heard this from all sorts of large organizations, actually, be they in financial services or manufacturing or even, certain kinds of media and advertising activity. They've been very active in selling ads in that space, for example, but haven't moved all of their infrastructure out into it. And so they still have plans to. Those plans are, over the next 2 years to grow what they're doing in cloud, but there's still a lot of things on premises, and there's going to continue to be for years to come. And of course, we have seen, since we're to some extent glomming together cloud and open source in this broad category, we have seen folks say that those are very different topics for them, that cloud they see as an opportunity and they're taking full advantage of it to the best of their ability. Open source they see as open risk, and they try to keep it out of their infrastructures as much as possible. And so a good and important reminder there that as ubiquitous as open source has come to be, it's still not universal. And there are always going to be folks who resist it and or refuse it based on their own assessment of its risk versus their tolerance for risk. I'm not going to dwell on each of these slides with the pie charts on them. They are summarizing the technology adoption and perceived value data that we saw in summary in the table previously. I'll just note that about 70% of organizations say they're currently across multi-clouds and in some way using a security policy engine that helps them make that spanned operation a reality, but that only 50% have measured and consistently realized the value of that investment and that set of operational commitments. And everybody else is seeing less or less consistent value, or are still trying to figure out what the value is. And when we look at service mesh, and that cluster of technologies, we have a much lower level of adoption. But for the folks who are deploying it, over half are in that real, perceived, measurable, and consistently demonstrated value category. A somewhat surprising and unfortunate 11% still don't know if they're receiving value of any sort from their deployment of these technologies. So hopefully that one will get resolved before we ask again. With open source in and for security, we have seen fewer than a third of organizations say that they are using this now, and a noticeably larger chunk, almost 40%, say that they are not even considering doing so. However, for that almost a third who are using open source in security, all of them, 100%, say that they have seen real perceived, measurable, consistently demonstrated value from that use of the technology. So a good reminder to those who are cautious about it, fearful of it, not even considering it, it is delivering a lot of value to the folks who are going there. And then with respect to teams, most folks have teams, and with respect to use cases, most folks have defined use cases, likewise metrics and KPIs, some kind of defined governance structure. We're starting to tail from nearly 70% down to just over 60%. Training in cloud, yes. Budget line for cloud, yes, and a huge change from just 3 or 4 years ago. And then have we revised our operations? We're just over half on that, with a significant chunk planning to yet this year. And do we have a strategy for integrating cloud and open source stuff into our operations and environment? Yes, over 3/4. And lastly, a strategy. Again, just over 3/4. Some of the use cases that we've seen folks calling out, things that are getting them into cloud or that have been the focus of their cloud efforts to now, have been very business line focused, streamlining the business, doing that without sacrificing security. We're also seeing a lot of folks saying, we are taking a lot of advantage of cloud storage, getting out of the business of running enormous storage arrays in your data center, or at least not continually expanding the size of those data arrays, is something a lot of folks are very interested in. But of course, and we'll see this in the data and analytics section, it can lead to its own problems with respect to getting that data all into the mill of analysis. Oh, and I should probably point out that one right there in the middle, core production is not running in the cloud for us right now. We're looking at whether elements should be, but it's very latency sensitive. So there'd be a lot of architecture involved in moving things into the cloud in a way that would preserve performance and control latency to an acceptable level, at least for them. Everybody's mileage varies, depends so much on what their core production systems are. So shifting our focus to data analytics, I'm going to take a moment and say, folks, if you've got questions, please drop them into the Q&A panel. We have some questions already lined up, but please add your questions to the Q&A panel as they occur to you. Don't think, oh, well, I'll ask that question when we get to the end during the Q&A session. You might forget by then, or you might have had other questions occur to you and never get back to that first one. So blast them in here as they occur to you, and I will answer them either right on the moment or when we get to the Q&A at the end. Excuse me. So in data analytics, our Bellwether technologies are having a data science platform in place, having robust metadata management practices, metadata management tools in place, data catalog, discovery engine, search engine that works across data streams and data sources, having data lakes, and having a data warehouse. Data warehouse is in no way an emerging technology. In a sense, it's been around for what, I think 2 decades at least, but we are still finding a significant number of organizations thinking about them that have never had a need for them or cause to adopt them in the past. But what we saw when we went out and asked formally was that was really more a matter of who you asked within the organization, because it turned out almost everybody or everybody is running a data warehouse at this point. It's just some folks aren't aware of it. So what we saw in data and analytics, as I hinted at earlier, is an extraordinary degree of maturity across the enterprises that we spoke to. The lowest level of maturity was in deployment of technologies and in realizing the highest level of value from the technologies deployed. But even there, nobody's in the unprepared boats, and only a minority in the technology space are in the reactive level, and you get 80% either proactive or anticipatory in the technologies being adopted, and 100% either proactive or anticipatory in realizing value solidly and reproducibly from these technologies. And with respect to sort of the overall comments that people made to us as we were discussing these things with them, again and again, the idea that hybrid operations and therefore hybrid data pools leads to some of the most significant challenges in this space. That came up multiple times and across multiple industries, having to figure out how to integrate the off-premise with the on-premise data for the purposes of analytics and having a more data-driven business. We thought it was great that one of the lines of business in this organization had gone into the business of selling data and analytics around that data back to the rest of the organization, and to sort of expose the costs of that to competition. That's a very bold move in a lot of organizations. And this other comment down near the end, I think, highlights why in this space the level of maturity is so high. There's extensive executive visibility into the quality of data and data management, and analytics are relied upon by folks at the executive level for making correct decisions about the future of the business. So there's a lot of high level attention, and therefore, you know, the pressure of that attention on data and analytics in a way that there isn't a similar level, sustained anyway, a similar sustained level of attention for whether or not you're using cloud or you have a service mesh running inside your cloud environments. It's a different perspective from the institution. So data science platform, extremely widely adopted, extremely high level of realizing that value, seeing it consistently. Metadata management, exactly 70% saying they've got that, and 80% of them saying that they're getting the highest level of value out of that. Data lakes, similarly 70%, and almost 90% saying we're getting the highest level of value from that. Data warehouse, as I said, 100% of the organizations turned out to be running those, and 90% saying they're getting the highest level of value out of that. And then looking at all of those non-technology areas, operations, process, planning, strategy, budgeting, KPIs, training, all of those, 100% of organizations say that they have those things in place in data and analytics. So it's an entirely higher level of enterprise maturity in this space than in any of the other spaces that we looked at. So we see the use cases for data and analytics, vary dramatically from industry to industry and even from business to business within an industry. We see some fairly common themes. One summed up in this comment, or this use case, I should say, around exceptions analysis. Everybody's very focused on looking for the anomalies in their data. And one company is even building a line of business that is focused on identifying the anomalies in their data, which they take to indicate process failures that they can then fix, and selling that back as a service to the rest of the business. There's other comment at the bottom about onboarding more ETL platforms so that they can have more cleansed data in their data lake for their analytics to take advantage of. Points up an issue that is very real to pretty much everybody in the space as well, the concern over the potential for exponential growth of the amount of data being stored, as well as the amount of data coming out of the analysis. So the analyzed data stream can also conceivably grow exponentially unless a lot of care is taken to take advantage of deduplication technologies, compression technologies. So I'm going to leave this slide on the screen for a moment, and before we go into the Q&A panel, draw your attention to what's on the screen, but also the links in the attachments tab, which are directly related. You can use those links to connect with us. Well, actually, I think the link is to Jerry specifically via LinkedIn, but I'm John Burke, and you can find me under the Nemertes entry in LinkedIn and connect with me as well, please. You can also use links that you'll find there to register for the future episodes of this series, which are trends in frontier technologies. That's things like quantum cryptography, trends in workplace technology and infrastructure. So there we're looking at things like unified communications and trends in security and privacy. We'll be running those sessions weekly through the rest of August, and of course all of them will be available for replay pretty much immediately after the live presentation wraps up. On the attachments tab, not the applications tab, on the attachments tab, you'll also find a link, which you can see on the screen here, to the application on our website to join Nemertes online community, which is solely for enterprise IT professionals. So we go there, we post things about what we're seeing in our research or in our briefings from vendors or in our reading of the news, and we answer questions from IT professionals there, and we discuss things around different services that we provide or that they're looking for. So that said, we'll jump into questions, and right now I just have a couple. So now's the time. If you've got a question, throw it up in the Q&A panel. Question one, so the hype about how everyone and everything is in the cloud now, just hype? Yes, that is just hype, at least to the extent that it implies that on-premise is gone, on-premise is dead, and yes, everything is in the cloud. That is absolutely not the case. Right now, our data still says, somewhere between a third and 40% of enterprise IT is still running on premises. A chunk of it, not in data centers, but out in branch locations, in factories, And we expect that chunk to increase over time as more edge computing use cases emerge. The rest of it is still running in conventional enterprise data centers, and we don't see that dying out anytime soon. It's shrinking. There's kind of a right sizing going on. Yes, some of it is definitely about legacy systems that no one can make a business case for migrating into a cloud environment, at least not yet. Some of it is about concerns about data sovereignty or other kinds of risks associated with data. And some of it is about whether there's any cost benefit to moving what remains in the data center out of the data center. And there's a lot of use cases still where that is not the case. So we're into roughly a 70-30 or 60-40 split between cloud and on-premises, with the cloud stuff, and this is from other research we've done, split about evenly between SaaS and IaaS and PaaS. That is about half of it in SaaS and about half of it in IaaS and PaaS. We think that there will continue for years to come to be things enterprises, especially large enterprises, either have to run on premises or want to run on premises for whatever reason. So, yep, hype. Question 2. Is data analytics a done deal? Is it a solved problem? And I know that it sort of looked that way when I was talking about it. And of course, no, it's not really, but at an organizational level, at least, IT organizations have at least licked the problem of how to deal with the next thing that comes up in data. That's really kind of what we mean by anticipatory. They've got teams, they've got budgets, they've got strategies, roadmaps, and therefore the mechanisms for updating all those things when some kind of radical new technology gets dropped in, or some kind of radical change in the environment or in their needs for data analytics pops up. So yeah, data analytics is a done deal in that sense, sort of at the organizational level, but there's going to continue to be new technology brought to bear, especially as AI-related technologies continue to mature. There's going to be continually new opportunities for bringing together streams of data that haven't been brought together before in some way that generates value. There's going to continue to be changes in the regulatory and social environment that will require mild or drastic changes in how organizations work with and deal with the data and the analytics that they do on the data. So at that level, no, it's not a solved problem because there's always a new problem. And that was question 2 of 2. That looks like all the questions that we have for now. So thank you for your time. The recording of this webinar will be up on our Bright Talk channel shortly after I say goodbye. And if you found this valuable, please share the link to it with your friends, with your colleagues, with your mom and dad, with your kids. High school kids love nothing better than this kind of presentation, trust me. Please also take a moment after the session ends to rate the webinar. It's much appreciated, and it does help us develop our future content. If you haven't already, check out those links in the attachments tab too. And again, thank you very much for joining us today and for the questions, and we look forward to you joining us for the next episode. Goodbye.